So in this video, we are going to discuss an important, widely debated moral issue, which is the issue of abortion. And we're going to go through several arguments related to abortion, either supporting abortion or countering abortion. So the first argument is called the argument from humanity. And it goes like this. If the fetus is an innocent human being, then abortion is always, or perhaps almost always, immoral. The fetus is an innocent human being. Therefore, abortion is always, or perhaps almost always, immoral. So this argument is anti-abortion in that the conclusion says that abortion is immoral. So how might we counter this argument? There are two ways to counter. The first way would be to reject the first premise. So if we could say that the fetus is an innocent human being, but abortion is not always, or perhaps not almost always, immoral, then we could reject the first premise. So in this rejection, we would be conceding that the fetus is an innocent human being. We would be saying, fine, sure, let's accept that. But we would be saying, even though it's an innocent human being, there are still cases where maybe we cannot, or maybe we can indeed abort that innocent human being. An example of this might be something like the safety of the mother. The mother is in peril. Maybe she's hemorrhaging. The only way to stop it is to abort the fetus. And the doctor accepts that the fetus is an innocent human being, but still thinks that it's okay to abort it because of these health complications. The second way to reject the argument is to reject the second premise. The fetus is not an innocent human being. So here, we would be rejecting either that the fetus is innocent or that the fetus is a human being. Maybe the fetus is guilty of some crime, or maybe the fetus actually is not a human being in the sense that is relevant to these kinds of moral distinctions. The difficulty here would be to prove that the fetus is guilty of something, which seems kind of difficult given that the fetus is just sort of helplessly in the womb. And also the difficulty would be proving the fetus is not a human being when, as a matter of biology, the fetus has the DNA of a human being, has the structure of a human being, albeit undeveloped, and therefore, in a lot of ways, does seem like a human being. So you would have to specify the sense of human being here that the fetus doesn't fit, which would be maybe the moral sense or something like that. But either way, you would be rejecting this argument if you accepted either one of these. The next argument is the argument from potential. So it goes like this. If the fetus has the potential to be a person, then it has the same moral status as a person. Most fetuses have the potential to be a person. Therefore, most fetuses have the same moral status as a person. A person's moral status includes having a broad set of fundamental rights, including the right to life, the right not to be killed. Therefore, most fetuses have a broad set of fundamental rights, including the right to life. If a fetus has a right to life, then aborting it is immoral. Therefore, in most cases, abortion is immoral. So again, like the argument from humanity, this is also an argument that is anti-abortion. So how would we reject this argument if we were going to try to reject it? So one, what we might do is say that the fetus has the potential to be a person, but it has different moral status as a person. So here we're accepting the fact that it has this potential. We're not trying to argue that. But we treat things differently when they have potential versus when they have that actual status as a person, right? A potential person and an actual person, maybe we want to treat those with different moral status. One way of thinking about this is that we don't typically treat everyone with the same moral status anyway. There are certain cases where we have exceptions, right? We have rights of attorney for people who are incompetent, or we have guardians for children, right? These are different moral statuses. There are different rights associated with these. So second, we could say that most fetuses have no potential to be a person. This is probably a weak rejection because it does not seem true, and that's fairly obvious. Most fetuses, assuming most fetuses can come to term, most fetuses do have the potential to be a person because as long as they are brought to term, they'll be a person in the same sense that we are. So this would only be true in a somewhat tragic circumstance, like a circumstance where 99% of fetuses never came to term, never were born. In such a circumstance, we might be able to say this. But if we're in a circumstance like we find ourselves where there are a lot of fetuses that actually become a person, then we probably don't want to say this. So the next thing we could say is that a person's moral status does not include having a broad set of fundamental rights, including the right to life, the right to not be killed. So in this one, we could interestingly say that, people actually don't have rights. We could just reject the idea that people have rights. Or we could say that they don't have this specific right. They don't have a right to life. So they may have other rights, but they don't have the right to not be killed as a fetus, right? That might be something we could say. This one's difficult to defend because I think that in general, we do in fact have rights stipulated legally. And many of these rights that are legally stipulated track broadly with what people think are our moral rights. But even if we didn't have these rights legally, it seems like a lot of people have the intuition that we aren't okay with people just going around killing each other. So in that sense, it doesn't seem like this is very strong rejection, unless we have some kind of further explanation. The next thing we could do is we could say that a fetus has a right to life, but aborting it is not immoral. So this one, similar to with the argument from humanity, we could just accept everything except that a fetus has a right to life. We get all the way there, but even though a fetus has a right to life, we still can abort it. So why might that be? Well, it might be the case that we have rights, so we have a right to life, but we only have those rights under certain circumstances. So maybe a baby has the right to life, and a fetus has a right to life, but because the fetus is in the womb of the mother, that right to life can be overridden by the mother's rights. So let's say the mother has a right to life too. The fetus has the right to life, but that right to life doesn't override the mother's right to life. So if the mother is suffering a severe hemorrhage or some other complication, then the mother's right to life might override the fetus's right to life. So if we accept any of these, then we've rejected the argument from potential. So next we have the argument from ensoulment. It goes about like this. It is immoral to kill any innocent human being who has a soul. All human fetuses are both innocent and have a soul. Therefore, it is always immoral to kill a human fetus. Once again, this is an argument against abortion. So how might we counter this argument? So first, we might say that it is not immoral to kill any innocent human being who has a soul. So we might say that we can indeed kill some innocent human beings, and we might indeed kill innocent human beings that have a soul. So we do think, in general, that it's possible that sometimes it's okay to kill human beings who have souls. If we say that a person has a soul, but we still want to give them the death penalty, this might be an example of that. But for the death penalty, at least, we think that it's actually a guilty human being. So that wouldn't totally get us there to rejecting premise one. What we would have to say is there are some cases where we can kill an innocent human being. So an example we might give for this, we might give something like we gave before with the idea that if the mother is going to die, if they bring the baby to term, then we really are stuck in a bad position of having to make a choice, something like medical triage, where we actually have to choose between the mother and the fetus. If we choose the mother, then we have essentially killed an innocent human being who has a soul, which is the fetus. So that might be a case where it is moral to kill an innocent human being to save another innocent human being with a soul. The second thing we could do is we could say that not all human fetuses are both innocent and have a soul. So we've already discussed the idea that maybe a fetus might not be innocent, but we haven't discussed the idea that a fetus might not have a soul. So, for one, talking about souls in general assumes that souls exist. Not everybody does assume that souls exist. So, if you were an atheist, let's say, who didn't believe in any supernatural objects, and souls are supernatural objects, then you might just say, well, I reject premise 2 because I reject the idea that anything has a soul. You could say that. There also might even be religious sects that hold such beliefs. So they might believe that the human body and the human person are one and the same. There is no such thing as this extra soul. There may be sects that believe that, so it may not just be the atheist that makes that claim. But also, you have to be more specific. Some sects might think that there's a soul, but they might not think that the soul comes into the fetus. So you could say the soul comes at conception. You could say that the soul comes at birth. Or you could say that the soul comes somewhere in between. As long as we don't know when the soul comes, then it's difficult to even say that all human fetuses have a soul. Depending on what we think the soul is, that might determine when we think the soul comes. But that's a question, that's a metaphysical question that is more difficult to answer, because we would have to have a complete theory of souls and a complete theory of bodies, and then sort of specify when in fact the soul enters the body. So if we're just agnostic about when the soul enters the body, then we can probably say that premise 2 is in serious doubt. And even if we're religious, we might be of the religious belief that the soul doesn't enter at conception, it enters at some other time. So if we accept either of these, then we've rejected the argument from ensoulment. So the next argument is the infanticide argument, and it goes about like this. If infanticide is immoral, so too is abortion. Infanticide is immoral, therefore abortion is immoral. So once again, we have an argument against abortion. So how do we counter the infanticide argument? We could counter it in two ways. First, we could say that yes, we do think infanticide is immoral. We're not going around killing babies. But abortion is not immoral. So in this case, we think infanticide and abortion are different. There's some kind of category difference that's morally relevant. Infanticide is on the immoral side of this difference, and abortion is on the moral side of this difference. So maybe we think that there's some threshold of development, and babies are past it, but fetuses are not. Now that would be hard to argue if, let's say, we have a baby who could be viable. So let's say the baby could be a preemie. They could be born early. And in that case, really, they are an infant. They just are an infant that is in the womb still. Were they taken out of the womb, then they would suddenly have moral status. But when they're in the womb, they don't have this moral status. That's a little bit difficult to argue for, because we tend to think that a baby would have moral status no matter where it is. It's not as though the baby has different moral status in one room and different moral status in the other room. But at least in the case of abortion, one relevant difference is that it's in the body of the mother. So we have the health needs of the mother also under consideration, which might make there be a relevant moral difference. The second thing we could do is say that infanticide is not immoral. So this might be a hard sell to say this, because we're not, at least in Western contemporary culture, we're not in the habit of going around killing babies. But at least some cultures have thought this. Some cultures have thought that they could essentially, for various reasons, let babies die, and it was not as bad as killing an adult. The famous example of this are Inuit peoples who leave the baby out in the snow when they can't feed it. In a case like this, you might argue that the overriding consideration is the good of the tribe, and not being able to feed the baby, they need to deal with the baby in a way that eliminates its suffering and also allows everybody else not to suffer because of lack of food resources. So that might be an example, though it probably would be an example that a lot of people wouldn't like to bite the bullet on. So the next argument is the argument from personhood. So it goes like this. If a being is not a person, then it lacks any moral rights. Fetuses aren't persons, therefore fetuses lack moral rights. If a being lacks moral rights, then it is morally acceptable to treat it in any way we like, including kill it. Therefore, it is morally acceptable to kill fetuses. So this is our first argument that is in favor of abortion, or is at least thinks that abortion is permissible. So how do we counter the argument from personhood? So the first thing we might say is, a being is not a person, but it does not lack any moral rights. So for this one, there might be a category of non-persons that have rights. So not all of us might think that animals have rights, but some want to give certain rights to animals, and some of those rights might not be for persons. They might not think the animal is a person, but they might think the animal is still, in spite of not being a person, is still entitled to certain moral rights, something like that. A second thing we could do is just say that fetuses are persons. So we could say, fetuses are biologically human, and everything that's biologically human is a person. That might be a little hard to swallow because, my fingernail might be biologically human, but my fingernail is not a person, probably, under most moral systems. So for this one, we might say that the fetus does indeed have the relevant thing that makes them a person, whatever that is. That might not be their humanity, that might be their consciousness, if the fetus is said to have consciousness, or it might be their potential, as we've said before. Something about a fetus might be said to have personhood. The next thing we could do is we could say that a being lacks moral rights, but it is not morally acceptable to treat it in any way we like, including killing it. So in a case like this, we might say something analogously like of a tree. We typically don't think trees have rights, but is it okay to just chop down a tree for any reason? There might be reasons why it's not okay to chop down that tree, right? Even though the tree has no rights, there may be some other reasons. So it may be imprudent to chop down that tree. It might be a good shade tree, or it might be a good fruit tree for you. It also might be somebody else's tree, and we can't just chop down anybody's tree. So similarly, the fetus might lack moral rights, but we still can't just treat it any way we want. We still have some considerations that we have to abide by when we are dealing with even things that don't have rights. So the next argument is Thomson's argument from analogy. So this argument's based on a famous analogy by Judith Jarvis Thomson, and it goes like this. If it is morally permitted to unplug from the violinist, then it is morally permitted to unplug from one's fetus, that is, to terminate one's pregnancy. It is morally permitted to unplug from the violinist, therefore it is morally permitted to terminate one's pregnancy. So for context here, in this thought experiment, the violinist has been hooked up to you by force, by people who want to keep this violinist alive. The violinist is suffering from a terminal condition, and they need your blood in order to stay alive. So by hooking them up to you, they're being kept alive, but you never gave permission from this. You were, I think, knocked unconscious and hooked up to them, and now you awaken and you realize that you've been hooked up to them and you're trying to decide what to do. And so once again, this is an argument that abortion can be permissible, like the last argument. Okay, so how might we counter this particular argument. So first we might say that it is morally permitted to unplug from the violinist, but it is not morally permitted to unplug from one's fetus, that is, to terminate one's pregnancy. So here we might say that there's a relevant moral difference between the violinist example and the example of a fetus and a mother. So in the violinist example, notably, you were done forcibly, hooked up to the violinist. That might be relevant because in most pregnancies, the mother wasn't forced into it, unless we consider it to be like the force of their anatomy that's forcing them to do it. But most of the times, the only kind of abortion, or the only kind of pregnancy that would be analogous to the violinist case would be a pregnancy caused by rape, because a pregnancy caused by rape, in that pregnancy, the sex was forced upon the mother, just like the person who's plugged into the violinist, they were forced to be plugged into the violinist. So in such a case, we might say, well, yeah, the violinist argument holds, but only for pregnancies regarding raped victims. The second thing we might say is it is not morally permissible to unplug from the violinist. So we might just say, you didn't choose it. You didn't choose to be hooked up to that violinist. But now that you are, unplugging would kill them, you, for better or worse, you unfortunately, by the cruelty of fate, I guess you could say, you now are bound to that violinist and have certain responsibilities to them that only you can fulfill. So you might say that. There are certain things you could say, well, you didn't choose the responsibility, but the responsibility was thrust upon you in a way. And now you have to live under those, in accord with those new responsibilities. That's something you could say against that second premise. All right. The next argument is the protection of interest argument, and it goes like this. If the only way to protect a person's very important morally legitimate interests is by killing a non-person, then it is permissible to do so. In almost all cases of unwanted pregnancies, the only way to protect a woman's very important morally legitimate interests is by killing a non-person, the fetus. Therefore, in almost all cases of unwanted pregnancies, it is permissible to kill the fetus. So once again, this is an argument for the permissibility of abortion. So how might we counter this one? So the first thing we might say is that the only way to protect a person's very important morally legitimate interests is by killing a non-person, but it is not permissible to do so. So in this counter, we are acknowledging, yes, the mother's interests are important. That's true. And we would have to kill the fetus in order to protect those interests. But don't do it. It's not permissible. Maybe what we're saying is that even though some interests are morally important, other interests are also morally important. So maybe we could say that there are interests associated with the fetus. Maybe they're the fetus interests, or maybe they're the interests of society. But there are morally legitimate interests that make it not permissible to kill the fetus anyway, even though we've acknowledged that the mother has interests too. So that could be one way of going about it. The second way is to say that in almost all cases of unwanted pregnancies, the way to protect a woman's very important morally legitimate interests is not only by killing a person, the fetus. So what does this mean? So this would be essentially to reject the idea that the mother has to abort the fetus in order to be protected. So how might we justify this? We might say that the majority, there are some pregnancies that are very dangerous for the mother, but the majority are not very dangerous for the mother, we might say. And because the majority are not dangerous, the woman's interests are compatible with being pregnant. The mother can still do all the things that she was doing safely before being pregnant. And so basically, having the abortion is not necessary to protect her interests in that case. Obviously, if we're going to say that, we would only be confining it to those interests that aren't affected by the pregnancy. So if it was a truly dangerous pregnancy, then we could say, oh yeah, that's actually perhaps a situation where the only option is aborting the fetus, because otherwise the mother will die. But let's say it's a totally safe pregnancy. Let's say there's no complications. Let's say actually the mother is healthier than ever, and they have no nothing. They can still go to their job. They can still do their hobbies. Everything that the mother did before, they're continuing to do, even though they're pregnant. In that case, we might say, well, why would you abort the fetus? It's not harming you anyway. Just go about your life while pregnant. You might say something like that. So that's another way of rejecting this particular argument.